Check. Can you guys, am I audible? Okay, great. All right, thank you all so much. I know somebody mentioned the afternoon slump. I think we're all undergoing it to some extent. There's a lot of pressure on the panelists today to not let everyone go to sleep. I think Divya did a great job of trying to wake everyone up. I've always admired what Divya has spoken about and done, and she's just captured everything that we've spoken about and we've thought about so beautifully up here. And I just want to agree with very, very strongly with one thing that Divya said, especially since, we're at a university. I think the one thing that I have benefited most from is not trying to look at any one subject as a discipline. When you start looking at problems individually and then trying to build every sort of capacity that you can to solve that problem, I think that goes a much longer way. And maybe you guys can chime in on that. You all know the esteemed panelists. I will be moderating today's session. I have the distinct privilege of knowing everyone on the stage, so this is going to be hopefully friendly. And for you guys, I'm not the one under the radar. And I just want to take a quick side note. I know that Pavan was not able to make it today, but I hope you all get to hear from him. He's also such a fantastic orator. And with that, we can start. And before I come to my panel, I have a quick question for everyone in the audience. Quick 2 questions. How many of you have wanted to, at some point in your career, want to create impact? Show of hands. Okay, great. That's almost everyone. And how many of you have worked on or think that working in the social sector is what is going to help you create that impact? Okay, that's still fairly a large number. I think we'll come back to this because everyone has a point on this question. But just to set a little bit of context on the topic that we're here with, I'll go with Kriti because she's right next to me. And I want to start with one question to all of you. You guys have been in this field for such a long time. How have you seen the sort of appetite for and the place for behavioral economics, or if we want to refer to behavioral sciences, in the social sector? How do you think it's changed, where, at least in India, in the Indian context, where it came from, how it's sort of transformed and developed in the last few years? Kriti?
Thanks, Devyani. I think you might be in a better position to answer this, but I'll just tell you from my experience. I think when even Busara started out in India, the appetite was pretty low and we had to go for the lower hanging fruits, where we had to, for example, go for behaviors that were easier to change there was intention from people to change behaviors, but we just had to bridge the intention-action gap. And not going for something which required much more effort, or something like gender norms or social norms that require a lot of time to change. So we had to go for the lower hanging fruits, and also the policy narrative was missing. For example, as I think Divya also mentioned, that in the US when the Obama administration came, that's how behavioral science picked up some speed. In India, that narrative was missing, that evidence was missing. But I think in the last couple of years, with BIU being formed in Niti Aayog, with behavioral science being a mandate for some of the UN organizations, with Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, with Swachh Bharat Abhiyan being posed as behavioral campaigns, I think the appetite has gone up. But one thing the change that I've seen, so I come from a consulting background, so at Basara we do a lot of consulting. But the one thing that we've seen change is that now a lot of funders are coming to us thinking of behavioral science as a silver bullet, that it's a problem, fix it with your magic wand. But so we've had to also face this problem that it's not a silver bullet, it's a tool in the toolkit. And there have to be a lot of things working simultaneously for behavioral science to also work. So I think that's a shift in perception that I've seen, that in the last couple of years, with the increase in evidence, people have now also started seeing behavioral science as like a silver bullet. And we have to understand, while behavioral science is a tool, it is also, it's not a silver bullet, it's a tool, but we also have to understand that when do we not use behavioral science is as important as when to use behavioral science.
Okay. Um, so I have a different theory for what is social. So I'll probably answer that when you ask that. But in the public sector, the kind of changes I have seen is there are two ways I can say this. Earlier, all of behavior science. When I got out of finance and I was exploring what I wanted to do in this development space, I realized that all of behavior change was clubbed under social behavior change communication. It was all just communication, communication campaigns, and their design. Otherwise, we are now doing a lot of like urban design projects where we are applying behavioral science at insights level, at impact assessment level, and also like at intervention level. Actually, in this space, another change that I see happening is this appetite for participatory approaches. So what Divya spoke about, libertarian paternalism does work in many contexts, but I think one of my ex-clients is also here, where we started with applying behavioral science in small projects for industrial safety in their factories, and they wanted to create this behavioral science process, and we kind of like helped them, and now the person has come as a behavioral science lead, so they are starting to build their team, and stuff like that. And there, when we did, that's the first time I applied participatory, where we kind of built some of the solutions. We didn't design the solutions as designers. We designed it based on what was locally available, right? That's one type of participatory, that way that sustainability happened. But now another project that we are doing is to improve mobility access for the informal sector in the cities. And there again, we are actually bringing them in the decision-making process and building interaction with the municipal government, and their decisions are going into how to, building route maps. Where do I want my buses? So I think that's one change. The appetite for participatory approaches is becoming more, is being received by funders, is being received by executioners, implementation partners, which I think is one of the ways to go as well, even as a company will be going forward with. So that's a few bit.
Thanks, Divyani, for the question. And if you want to ask about acceptability of behavioral science and appetite of behavioral science in development sector, then we'll have to at least look at different parts of the dev sector, right? So when you talk about the government and the implementing arm, there are other implementing partners. Let's look at that cohort. In that cohort, I think if you look at, say, Gartner hype cycle, they're sort of climbing the hype cycle for behavioral science. To take an example, so CSBC's Niti Ayog's the BIU there analyzed 131 central schemes and centrally sponsored schemes. About how many of them have any behavioral science, any behavior, sort of in the policy itself, right? So 30 odd had some phrasing to talk about behavior. Guess how many had any behavioral inputs, outputs, outcomes defined? One had. So that's the kind of delta that the government and implementing agencies are dealing with. Behavior is not in their current scheme of things, but they've started to hear a lot more and getting a lot of excitement around it. So that's climbing the, that curve. As a funding agency, which I'm part of, there's a lot of pressure of evidence-driven policies like Divya and others have mentioned from SBST in US. There's a lot of rigor there, and all the chatter for the last 5 years is behavioral science going through a confidence crisis, behavioral science going through a replicability crisis, and outright fraud in terms of Dan Ariely and Francesca Gino. Right? So because of which internally at funding agencies and a lot of evidence-based organizations, there's that trough of disillusionment, we're there. And if you talk at behavioral science practitioners out there, there are a lot of CSBC to Busara to others, and given the fact that there is a lot more push towards pre-registration, data, making your data available outside, I think that's climbing the scope of enlightenment. That's how I would say the appetite across different parts of the dev sector is, it's different. Yeah.
No, I think that's a great point, and I think maybe we can cover some of it in future questions. But I just wanted to also point out, the previous two panels, impressively have had a lot of representation from industry, and I think, which was great, but the language, like we spoke about jargon, was different. And Divya's talk, very nicely segued into a very development sector language. So I'm going to work around this word of impact that we've thrown around, because that's our little, where's the needle going for the private sector. For us is, we look at impact. And so, which is also why we had that question in the beginning. And I'll come to you, Shri. You and I have spoken about this before, and I think you have some very interesting ideas about even what the definition of a social, like what we call social sector, development sector, public sector. Where is the boundary? Where do these separate? And why do we look at them? And this is also another reason why our jargon gets so, distinct, and we're not able to sometimes speak each other's language and then not work together as well as we could. So do you want to take that on the distinction between these?
Yeah, so some of them actually came and asked me, I want to work in the social sector, how do I get into it? And then Bangalore is very known for corporate employees saying, I wanted to now do something good and I want to get into the social sector, so I've shifted my field, and there is proud associated with it, which is good. But the understanding of what's social, I think when I was looking to setting up my business, that's where I think I made my point of view in this, is that we're all social beings. Wherever you have a behavioral problem, that why isn't that a social sector? Like, I am here because me and my company is known for like doing social sector projects. But I'll give you an example of a couple of projects, right? There was this pharmaceutical company that came to us, said, hey, we started with giving like affordable medicines to the low-income group. Now we want to expand to the elite, but the elite are like stopping us. They don't trust us just because they think that if you are serving the low-income, there is no quality. Then how do we go about our marketing campaign, right? We provided insights and campaign inputs for it. There was this other project which is an NGO, and they use tech to to kind of produce civic participation habits in citizens in the city. So we worked with them to look at nudges and how communication nudges can be used to kind of build that habit generating in the tech. Now, which is social here? Just because someone is in the citizen, with the citizen, just because I'm working with an NGO, does it mean it's a social sector? Or just because I'm just working with a pharmaceutical company, so that's a private sector? I mean, that's the fundamental question I'm asking, right? So if you're working even if you're doing a project that's for an organizational culture, that's also social. So for me, development sector, yes, okay, so how does social differentiate from development? Social is everything. Development, I think it comes from this whole, Human Development Index, Millennium Development Index, now we have SDGs, the whole idea of like society and development. For me, that's also a broad spectrum, but I think people can choose what they define development. It could be infrastructural, or it could be like systemic policy, because development is everywhere. And then comes public. At least for me, the way I see it is public is what everyone's, Divya largely spoke about and Shikhar speaks about, is looking at scale and how the government and policymakers look at scale and at a national level or a multiple state level. That's how I differentiate it. So I still don't know what social development or companies that just focus on social development versus a Swiggy or a business is, because I'm also in a consulting business which is for profit, but that does work on like multiple projects, right?
No, I think this is a great point, and the example that's coming to my mind is also what one of the earlier panels we spoke about, how an alcohol association was studying alcoholism. So while the incentive structures we like to, the way that we understand them seem somewhat linear, there's also byproducts and leakages that we don't always account for or we don't always know, but it's always this process of exploration and discovery, and you don't really know where impact is going to come from. And so while that it's a noble goal to work towards, I think there's also incentive systems in general to look at differently. In fact, speaking of that and also impact that we've brought up, and since Shekhar is on what I like to call the other side of the table, you can move there. No, but you know, the way that philanthropic organizations or donor and funder organizations look at sort of how to incentivize or prioritize certain sectors and you know, areas of focus, how does that, like, how does your understanding of impact have an impact on how you choose, or how influences how you choose these areas of focus? Because a lot of work in the development sector does get pushed through donor funded work. So where does that prioritization come from? Because I think it also helps people to kind of see what the
So I can talk about the experience at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where we don't have internal goals of, you know, here's the only areas that we'll work with. We are working on India's priorities for SDG goals. We are working therefore in priority areas which can move India's numbers for maternal health, neonatal health, family planning, etc. Right? So that's just primarily UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, etc. Which are the delta that you show in UP, Bihar has a national impact. This year, NFHS 5, for the first time, Bihar's anemia numbers didn't pull down India numbers. It's that level of impact that happens when you touch those states, right? The big states. In that, if you look at across health, where I primarily work, we do have very clear defined memorandums of understanding with the government saying we work on these sectors. And primarily, if you have to understand funding, the philanthropic funding goes into at-risk spaces, right? Where government can't step and spend money. It's philanthropic organizations that is supplanting, adding their forces and pushing it up. Right? So it's areas which tend to be neglected, where there's need to be more rigorous research, far more muscle behind it. All of these areas come with opportunity cost. Right? So in India, if you have to spend X, 100 rupees on sending a next set of vaccines to the 5% who would actually benefit from it, versus funding a behavioral insights research to say, would they actually take up vaccines? That's a hard decision for the government to take, for even BMGF to take. So we have to justify each and every dollar spent to say this is how it is laddering up to a bunch of outcomes that we want as the nation and as states in the nation. I've not really answered the question straight, so I'm just giving the complexity in decision making, and wading through all of these complexities, you make certain decisions. We will spend X amount of dollars and rupees on sending vaccines, Y amount on strengthening the number of doctors and nurses to actually do the work in the field, and Z amount of dollars on research on behavioral work. Right? That's, it comes together as a matrix.
Agreed. And I do have a question. I think that applies to all of you. I'll ask it at the end. But I have one for Kriti also, since we spoke about priority areas. So Busara has worked in India and in other countries in what we call the Global South on several of priority areas for Gates and for several other donor-funded organizations. When you talk about India in comparison to other countries, what are the sort of specific adaptations you had to make for our context, because that's what we've been talking about? What was the kind of resistance you faced? So what has worked, what hasn't, what has been something that you weren't expecting and that came out, something, that really blew your mind?
Thanks, Ivani, for that question. I think the biggest learning, especially after Divya's talk, I completely agree. The biggest learning for us also has been that context is everything. In fact, Divya, the example that you mentioned, about the scientist and the butcher, I will publicly accept that that was a study that was conducted in one of the Busara labs in Kenya. And as embarrassing as it might be, it's clear that we've learned the hard way how important it is to contextualize. You can't just pick up nudges off the shelf and apply them. While this might seem very straightforward that you have to contextualize solutions, in India what we also learned was that you can't even pick up behavioral science concepts and assume that they're going to apply here with this population, with the lower income populations that we work with. I'll give you an example. The Linda problem is a very famous way of assessing representativeness bias or the conjunction fallacy. We realized that that wasn't working in India because people could not relate to Linda. So we had to create a Preeti problem. We had to create a problem that people could understand what's happening, what people could understand our question. So I think when we talk about context, it's not just about contextualizing solutions and contextualizing nudges. You also have to think about what are you measuring and how are you measuring, and contextualize those also to make sure that your participants or your beneficiaries, they understand the stimulus, they understand the question, they understand the task that will help you understand whatever you're trying to measure. That was one. The second thing that we've had to adapt was the infrastructure for testing. Now, we've talked about Thaler's work, we've talked about Sunstein's work, we've talked about thinking fast and slow, but a lot of those learnings have come from experiments that they used to run in university labs. Now, the populations that we work with don't have access to these. So, while in Kenya, we created a physical lab where people, closer to the communities, where people would come, we would incentivize them, they would engage with experiments. That didn't work very well in India, especially with women, because there were like a lot of costs that we didn't account for. There was unreliable transport, the loss of wages, the daycare, childcare that they had to keep into account. Like, they can't just leave their households and come step out just to participate in your research. The community perception of women stepping out of their homes to participate in the studies was something that wasn't taken into account. So I think with CSBC we created mobile labs so that we could go to women and run some of these experiments. So we've also had to contextualize the infrastructure for testing. The last thing that I wanted to point out, which also resonates with what Biju talked about, was not just the research process, but also methodologies we've had to adapt. Biju mentioned how sexual preferences is obviously a very personal topic. In Kenya, we found that, especially when it came to contraceptives and family planning, women were quite open to talk to us about them. It was relatively easy to create a space where women could talk freely about this. In India, not so much. So we've had to employ other methods like card sorting, story completion, vignettes to understand their attitudes and perceptions around something like family planning. Whereas this was sort of expected because sex is a taboo. We've also faced this issue on a topic which is not a taboo, which is financial decision making. So to elicit true responses, we figured we can't just go and ask people, whether you have a fight with your spouse around financial matters. That didn't go down very well for us. We've had to adapt our approaches to understand how does financial decision making also happen between spouses. So we had to gamify all of that. We created a board game. We let the couple make financial decisions, and we just sat and observed, and that gave us the actual responses to how people make financial decisions in a bedroom. Those were some of the learnings.
No, this is great, and I just want to take a little sidebar. And do you want to add something before?
Your question was something interesting, something unexpected in the field. I wanted to, since Jafar talked about our relationship with food, I wanted to talk about a pilot that we ran. And anemia, we know, is a problem in India. Almost all, 50% of us are anemic, almost all cohorts. And one of the key things for anemia is that we have a diverse diet. 4 or more food groups has to be a practice. But we know food is a very habitual thing. You're just not buying outlandish items all the time. You're buying the same old all the time. And we said, how do we get men to add certain elements, diverse elements into their food basket? How do you get them to buy? Ran a pilot for this, but how do you get evidence of this working? We asked people, they reported some numbers, etc. Yes. But we also asked them, so can you submit pictures of what you ate? Right? And we ran this pilot for 3 months. People, we incentivized them saying, you'll get X rupees talk time. I don't remember the exact number. We said, for every picture, we'll just add your name into the pool. Every week, we'll draw. And this went for 3 months. We got a number of, there's lots of results that came out. That's not the interesting point. The company that was running this experiment ran with it for another year. What they saw, they stopped all the incentives. People continued to post photos. We have now 1 million plus photos of people's food from across India. That's actually not incentivized at all. So it's far more natural. Yes, there is a bias of presenting better plates, but with photos come metadata. We know the amount of rupees the phone model would approximately have costed. So to get a sense of what cost and what potential socioeconomic groups are you falling into, right? Do you have a good spread of that? Now, all of that has led to a super humongous data set which potentially is now being used to train how do you identify diverse food groups in out of an image, which can be now used in, say, Anganwadis to understand midday meal scheme in schools, etc. Right? So that's the sort of side effects that happen. What is also interesting is how stupid I was to say we should actually incentivize people to post food. We naturally do this on a regular basis. We should have, in hindsight, should have just made that as a natural assumption. It's, going to people's motivation and intrinsic motivation to do something, collaborate with you, to actually give you, be part of the research. That's far more powerful than actually incentivizing people on, small talk time or whatever. Interesting aside on multiple side effects and positive effects of a data set, also on how stupid we can be when designing interventions and research.
No, I think this is so cool what you both have said, because I have two small sidebars and one of them relates to what both of you have said. We spoke in the morning, I think on the first panel about the intersection between industry and academia, and a lot of times we do struggle with creating true naturalism for experiments, and there's so much scope with so many of the private sector players who are in the room now also, and even otherwise, who have access to this scale and to the things that people are using on a daily basis, which can be used for further understanding and which benefits both sets of partners. So that's just one of the sidebars. And the other thing, what Kriti had said, a lot of people spoke about practicing as a way of getting into the field or understanding. Everyone's spoken about you need to practice, but what you need to practice is a lot of the tools and methodologies that Kriti's mentioned and everyone else has been mentioning. These are the kind of things to be practicing in whatever fidelity is possible in whatever ecosystem. So that was just a small sidebar, and I have one final question for all of you, and then we'll go to the audience. We start from Shekhar, because we start from the other side this time. Shri, sorry, were you? We'll start from the other side. I just want to, sort of, because we touched upon the future of behavioral science and behavioral economics, what is something that you think is working today, but may not be working tomorrow? And by tomorrow, I just mean, hypothetical timeline, 5 years from now, 2 years from now. What is it something that if you could predict we needed to be prepared for, or not even predict, or just assess the present? What is working today may not work tomorrow.
We're very poor predictors of future. It's a core behavioral understanding. Okay, so but anyway, given that caveat, I will try to make predictions. One is, I think we have, as a group, I think Biju spoke about every professor has their own models and their own frameworks. As a community, that impacts transferability of knowledge, that impacts the ability to actually learn from each other, share data, have meaningful synthesis across data sets, etc. So this bespokeness has to come down, and I'll steal the phrase that my ex-CEO uses for data science, but it's equally applicable for behavioral science, right? We have to move from magic to mundane. as much as we move from very bespoke, arcane terminology that nobody likes, frameworks that nobody understands, to at least the core standards that we can as a group adopt, that would be something that is required, and over time we should get there. What is the over time, the landscape, I have no idea, but we'll see. That's also a wish from my end. The other one is, I think another panelist earlier also talked about this element of data. We have humongous data now sitting with us, with the devices that we have on us, to the interactions that we do on our digital devices. We can't be doing small scale interpretation, small qualitative work. The basis of what of behavior at least has to come from big data and large data. I'm not saying big data as machine learning, but that capability has to be built within the community to do a lot more large data analysis to at least understand what of the behavior. That is pure data of what's happening. Why of that behavior? Yes, there are frameworks that will come and explain, etc. But that muscle to work with large data has to be increasingly built into the process.
You said what is working and what could work and not work, right? So you mentioned this magic and magic to mundane before also, and I think every time you say that, participatory rings in my head because of my experience, that I think the mundaneness can be achieved when we start building interventions through participatory approaches, which is with the communities, which we are seeing. And in fact, we were able to develop a certain framework that are indicators of whether it's truly participatory or how representative it is and everything like that, right? And that framework is informed through behavioral research and understanding that community's decision making. It's still bespoke. It is probably not easily scalable because there are different contexts you'll have to consider as to which framework could work. But I think that's one thing that we could take forward, and this is coming from, we are good pattern recognition people, and as behavioral science practitioners, I think we just get better at recognizing patterns, and whatever we are probably suggesting the future could be are alternative futures that may come or not come, right? So from that angle, I think that mundaneness can be achieved through participatory approaches, but how scalable it is for government projects is going to be a question, but it is highly impactful. Another thing I think has to work is here for the students. What every panelist, every person who has spoken about is be ready to wear different hats. We are also as a society, I think, conditioned to think that you do one field of study, go and get your job, and that's it, right? Job is done. But I think behavioral science is very corely, at its core, it's interdisciplinary. And at its core, all we need is a problem-solving mindset. It doesn't matter which discipline you come from. As long as when you come into a company, you're able to kind of transfer your learnings from academia into other disciplines and also learn new disciplines, right? Like design. Many designers sometimes say that I got into design because I don't know maths well. Or many economists and development economists say, I don't know design well. I mean, but that's not going to work if you're going to work as a social change consultant. And I see that resistance simply because of unfamiliarity. It's not about intentional resistance always. It's just this unfamiliarity to grasp the complexity of the problems that we are trying to solve in the social development sector, in the development sector or in the public sector, right? So I think that has to change if we are looking at careers, and the whole culture that we are having of hopping between companies is actually aiding this process of developing more hats. And it's okay, have a long-term mindset of for 15 years I'm going to hop, and after that I'll find my grounding, right? Which is absolutely okay. That's what behavioral science needs, is my point of view.
I like the sound of that.
Yeah, I think much of it has already been covered. In fact, that's my wish too, that behavioral science stops existing as an independent, field, but is actually subsumed in everything that we do. apart from that, I think the one point that I wanted to make was right now, I think we see behavioral science as something that needs to work with existing infrastructure. And we, like I talked about the lower hanging fruits, where we've gone for changing behaviors where there is an intention, there's just an intention action gap. At some point that will need to stop, and we will have to, talk about social norm changing. We will have to talk about norm changing, whether it's gender norms, whether they're social norms, and that can't happen if you only target decision makers, at this age. You have to also go back and target the next generation. Also all together, you have to collaborate, and everyone has to be a part of this approach. So I think at some point we will have to stop talking about nudges and or these low-hanging fruits and start talking about how do we shift norms sustainably.
This is excellent. Thank you all so much. I'll just add my 2 pence to what you guys have also already mentioned. I just want to reiterate the point of perspective learning. Like, instead of going by, this is the degree I have to get, this is the master's I have to get, this is the PhD I have to get.
It will be very helpful.
Yeah, I think it's very important. Thank you for bringing that up. It's very important to understand when not to use. So I think the first step to when you are trying to, so I'm from a consulting background, when we get a project, I think the first step is to obviously define the problem. And when you're defining the problem, you have to understand whether the problem is behavioral in nature, or whether the problem is structural in nature, whether the problem is environmental in nature. What is the problem? And you can't really apply behavioral science if the problem is not behavioral. If the vaccines are missing, you can't have a behavior change campaign encouraging people to take up a vaccine. So that's what I meant by, you have to understand when the problem is behavior and when behavioral science can really come in.
Actually, this is a very important question. Do either of you have anything to add to that?
Not really. I think you've articulated really well, right? There are certain things where policies take over, laws take over, structures take over, infrastructure, product supply takes over, right? So you don't have to necessarily boil every problem and make it into a behavioral problem. The delta of impact on certain issues like Swachh Bharat, vaccines, etc. You needed to get the toilet before you started, making people go use toilet. And same with vaccines. Similarly, there are other problems where you don't necessarily have to focus here and now on this problem. Over time, you will have to add.
Sorry, I just want to add, but at the same time, if you are, so the systems that you consider, whether it's a policy level or at an infrastructural level, are actually building the context for the behavior to decide, right? Like for the decision making to happen. So someone else also spoke about how use of behavioral science after you have a problem versus using behavioral science from the start when you're developing your product or when you're developing your strategy. And that's again where I think you should keep in mind, I think systems thinking kind of helps this a lot more, where you look at the entire system and that's your decision making context, and you build your strategy based on what context you want to create to develop that desired behavior, right? So that's another way to look at, that way everything is a behavioral problem just because the context has everything and that feeds into the decision making, but it's about when you're talking about whether it's a behavioral problem, right? When you're solving for it, then you just focus on the behavioral, whereas when you're creating the entire product or the structure, you will have to look at everything, and behavior is at the core of it.
Anyone else?
Yeah, hi, hello, Navini here. So earlier there was a question like who left the who want to change and came to the social sector, and I am the example here. I left 16 years of corporate experience and joined the social sector. I'm working in e-governance now. The problem in between the private sector and social sector, in the private sector there's a clear demarcation of what is the kind of the achievement, the progress. You will see the user base has expanded, ROIs is X% we achieved. But what I see from my experience in recent past in the social sector, defining the definition of done in the social sector is very challenging. The bar is always rising. Once we achieve that, again the bar is getting extended. We have to change in the other retrospective way. So in social sector, this is the question it's been purging to me. So I'm need not be a straightforward answer, but how can we tell the definition of done in the social sector?
Is this question for someone in particular?
Not exactly, anyone can answer.
Can you just repeat the definition of the word?
What is the definition of done in the social sector from the behavioral science?
Done.
Yeah, completed. Because in the private sector, we can say, yeah, user base is extended and we got ROI, some percentage increase in the profits. Okay, but in the social sector, how can we define that? That's my question.
Shekhar's the best person. I'm joking. Anyone?
For every problem, you will have to define some success criteria, and you stop when that success criteria is done. So, social sector at least does a good job of identifying the theory of change, right? So, what is your input? What is your output? What is your outcome? What is your impact? If we say that, okay, if 90% of India has toilets, great, and job is done, then job is done. If we think that 100% banking has to be done, that's, somebody at some point will define your goals. India has signed up for maternal mortality reduction to achieve certain targets. Once you do that, your job is done. You transition it to the government, you transition it to others who take it forward and make it into policy, make it into your laws, for instance. There is no other way around it. We have a very good focus on theory of change and impacts, at least in the social sector. It shifts, but it's not with the sector does do a good job of that.
I want to add to this. I think it's the perception of what is social and private, right? When you think of social, probably you're like in your head thinking, for many people the vision is NGOs, and it's also slow. It's justified, we are in the social sector, so it's slow. I think that mindset is a problem, which is why is one of the problems. That's why probably there are not like systems where you have quarterly reflections or like yearly reflections to see what we have achieved and how to progress. But like Shekhar mentioned, when you come to development impact, there is this very stringent process of theory of change, looking at short-term outcomes, medium-term, long-term outcomes. So it kind of ends where the funding ends. But but also if you have that vision and strategy for outcome, you move on. But at the same time, it's also a problem for the private. Like one of the industry factory I was consulting for, where they want to improve the safety of industry factory workers, and one fundamental thing we saw was they said, hey, we have done like 93 trainings, and that is considered, okay, if we have done 93 trainings, then they know what safety is. And what you measure is important, which is an issue even in the private sector. So I think behavioral problems never end. It's more like you finish one and then the next thing comes. But if it's a band-aid solution that you are putting, then it is going to just get more wicked. But otherwise, it's in the process that you set up. I think the private is good at setting up those processes just because of the focus on the ROI. Whereas I think impact sector, the NGOs and all are not bad. I've worked with NGOs who actually have good foresight. They have markers and indicators that they want to achieve, whether it be livelihood or on the impact numbers, right? So,
agreed. Anyone else? I see a hand there.
Hi, so I work as a user researcher with social impact companies. So I've kind of experienced and touched upon different organizations and the way they do research with their beneficiaries or whoever they are intervening for. And one thing that I've always felt is it's very extractive, right? And to see social development organizations do extractive research, grab very personal behavioral insights from people, and then ultimately go create a white paper about it is very, depressing to see after a point of working in that space. So I wanted you to, like Sri Lakshmi, specifically elaborate what exactly does participatory mean, and can we also encourage participatory approaches in the sort of private sector, if that's possible at all?
Okay, I think from a process level, no one cares what process you follow. whether it's behavioral science or whether you're applying participatory or not. It's really the practitioner's value system that's guiding it. As long as it's achievable in time, it's accepted. Having said that, what participatory means is different for different practitioners, and it also has different stages, right? Like I gave an example of how the way we created intervention was with the people who are able to make those interventions, like the local printing shop, and we all come together and say, hey, okay, this is fine. But the most impactful side of participatory and what it really means is deciding on the intervention with the community. But on the research side, at the input side, what is participatory research is, for many focus group discussions is a participatory research approach, right? But for me, I don't have a definitive answer. It's a learning curve. But one thing I am starting to learn is that many a times when we work with, and it's in social sector, when we say that another visual that comes as rural or urban poor, when we work with the urban poor or the rural, the assumption is that, or at least people have this inkling that they probably have lower agency, they need our support. But with every research we do, we recently did a housing needs research inside, and we found that agency is not an issue. They have agency. All they need is support systems and social network that tells them the way and how to get their problem solved. So one of the things that we were suggesting to the client was, how about developing these interventions while the people know what's coming next for them, instead of one day telling, hey, we have done all of this, now you have to do this, right? That's one approach, and we are trying that in the mobility project a little bit, which I see is working. But from a participatory research perspective, I am not sure whether we can truly be participatory there, because it's research. Research by definition is slightly extractive. Another way people practitioners try to make it participatory is, hey, I am taking something from you, now you ask me what you want from me. It could be knowledge, it's not snacks and, I'm not talking about it. It could be knowledge, or it could be some work with them, exactly, right? So those are the ways we are practicing, but I don't know of a true definition of what it is.
Anyone else have any thoughts?
Yeah, some of the ways we've also been using, again, like, there's no one definition of participatory research, but one of the ways that we've also been using is to include the communities when we are designing for solutions, but also keep going back to them for feedback. So it's like an iterative feedback loop. So it's iterative prototyping. You do it once, you get feedback, you change it, you go back again, you get feedback, you go back again, and you change it until you are confident that, okay, this talks in their language, that they understand. Otherwise, I think what I understand of participatory research is your community is not just a participant, but also your research team. So you can employ some of them to, we're still figuring out, so I don't have any more answers, but like, I haven't used that enough. But that is something that we think about at Basara, how do we increase participatory research. But I think one of the major focuses for us is also to give back what we learn from them as knowledge back to the participants, to the community.
Okay, she's got one last point.
No, I just want to add to what you were saying and what Divya said, right? Which is regulation works. It's not because we know better. Sometimes you have to nurture a certain behavior. You have to build that context where you're touching upon paternalism a little bit. I also think it is okay, but that okayness is defined by the context of that problem.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope it wasn't too much of a slump. And back over to you guys. Thank you, panelists, for your time.
Thank you, panelists, for that informative closing session. I invite Dr. Charles Lisrado, SGA, to felicitate the panelists. Ms. Divyani Titi. Ms. Kriti Chauhan. Ms. Sri Lakshmi, and Mr. Shekhar Menon.